So it's a comic series that's set in Gotham, but not centered around any member of the Bat family. It sounds doomed to fail. So how did DC Comics make Gotham Central one of its greatest ever titles? Woof! Hey guys, it's me Marcus, aka the Mad Dog, and we're back with another video. Written by Rucka and Ed Brubaker, and illustrated initially by Michael Lark, the first issue of Gotham Central was published by DC Comics in December of 2002, with the 40th and final issue being released in April of 2006. And working for the GCPD might be the worst job in Gotham. Between interdepartmental corruption, soaring crime rates, a barrage of relentless supervillains that are just taking up resources, they also have to live within the shadow of the Batman. But can the Major Crimes Unit do enough to weaken the rising tide? Or is Gotham City just too far gone to be saved? Jumping into the art section now, and the majority of it's done by Michael Lark, and he's the guy who also gets the most recognition, and it's clear to see why. He just draws in a way that feels very reminiscent of early Sean Phillips and also Chris Samnee, but he also has a sense of realism to it despite being quite minimalistic. And that really helped to set the tone early on what Gotham Central is trying to be. And considering that at the same time you had people like Jim Lee working on Batman Hush, it really helped to solidify the fact that this is going to be something different from what's conventional, and it's not just another kind of Batman spin-off. And Lark's work really excelled when there was a massive amount of shadow or darkness. Yeah, I know that kind of sounds a bit like an insult, like, oh, if I can't see the majority of your art, that's when it's best. We just really showed off his ability to be able to convey the story and the emotions with as few lines as possible. And that's not me saying that there isn't detail, it's just that he's very selective with the detail that he gives us. Another area where I feel like the art was just spot on was during interrogations and conversations. And I feel like being able to illustrate dialogue well is the equivalent of sound design in a movie. Because if it's good, most people will just overlook it and they won't really pay too much attention, but if it's bad, you will notice it straight away. And to give credit where it's due, some of the other artists that were working throughout this also did a great job when it came to those interrogation scenes. But one theme that kept getting repeated throughout the story that I really loved was the dual interrogation. And the way it mirrored it and it showed the slight changes so that you could notice them yourselves, I think these were just perfect. They were definitely some of my favourite scenes in this series, and they're also the ones that would have been the easiest to mess up. Trust me, I've spent nearly 30 years in awkward conversations, so I'd know what one looks like if it's on the page in front of me. And I used the P word back there, but I don't think that everything about the art's perfect. Sometimes the detail that is there can look oddly placed, like the lines on faces, it would just look like somebody's had dirt thrown at them, and it doesn't always have as much weight behind the action as it probably could do. So sometimes a fight or a chase would feel a bit flat, or that it was just missing that kind of oomph. Corners are also cut when it comes to the backgrounds, which is disappointing because when Lark did do them, it was a real highlight. His Gotham felt like a real lived-in city. The police station was littered with files and corkboards of ongoing investigations, even if I do wish there would have been more Easter eggs that were scattered throughout there. So to see that the longer the series went on, backgrounds when characters were talking would just be filled with a flat colour was disappointing to say the least. And especially because I do really like Michael Lark, I think when I thought back about Gotham Central from when I read it the first time, I just thought about it all being perfect, so maybe my expectations were just way too high going into this. And like I said, I did notice a general dip in quality the longer that the series went on, and with Michael Lark leaving this partway through, I wonder if maybe he just lost his passion for it. Because despite the stories and the characters being interesting, I wonder how engaging it can be to just draw the same police station. There were also a couple of detectives that just weren't distinctive enough, which could make it tricky to know who was in a scene if they weren't being directly named. But to play devil's advocate, that could just be me because as we all know, I'm a dumb reader. And because of that, it'd make me happy when a Batman character would appear because at least then there's going to be no confusion. And when other artists do come in to fill in, it's pretty much the same story because a lot of their styles did seem to mimic what Lark brought. Guadiano, and I hope that's how you pronounce it, felt like he took the reins from Lark really well, so that wasn't really a jarring change. But there were a few other fill-ins in the middle part of this series that just didn't really match the style that well. They did try their best to put those different artists in a storyline that did feel separate from the rest of the main run, but still it just didn't really feel like Gotham Central. And if anything, especially at the time when this was published, it's just nice to have a really different looking style coming out from either of the big two publishers. So the art definitely is an aspect that does make it worth checking out, and I would recommend getting this in the biggest format possible. So if you did want to pick up the Omnibus, why not use the discount codes that we've got with the channel sponsor, Organic Price Books. They've got great packaging, fast shipping, and amazing customer services, and if you use code WOOF, you'll get $2 off your order. And if you're ordering 3 or more books and you want them to be delivered together, make sure you use code WOOFWOOFSHIPITTOGETHER for 5% off your entire order. Don't worry, you can just copy and paste them from the description down below and you can use these codes as many times as you like. We're jumping into the story section now, and this video came really close to being just the best on Gotham Central. It's so close to being one of those books that I just get lost in, and I don't really care about nitpicking everything, and I just really enjoy the story. But something stopped me from doing that because it falls just a bit short. And over the last year or so, I've made a point of going back to series that I really remember enjoying when I read them for the first time, but it has been quite a number of years since I last read them. And before I jumped into this, I was concerned that Gotham Central might be that book that falters most, but I am so happy to say that I was wrong. I don't want to lean on this too much because in a weird way it kind of becomes an insult, but this concept just shouldn't work. A long-running series that's just about the GCPD solving crimes, and you're going to remove the vast amount of the vigilantes that make this city interesting in the first place? Oh well, it should still be fine because at least you'll have Jim Gordon. Except even he's not in this book. So the fact that this book is as good as it is with a bunch of characters that we never really knew before just speaks to the strength and the quality of the writing. And the best thing that this book did was get the tone right from the first couple of pages. Yeah, I know at this point that's quite a generic compliment for me, and I'm kind of at the stage where I really want to read a book that just messes it up from the first issue, just to sort of refresh my perspective. But I have to give Gotham Central credit where it's due. The opening scene of Driver and Fields completing a check and just stumbling on Mr. Freeze, that was perfect. I cannot think of a better opening scene that this series could have done, and it's not just because one of the characters was called Marcus, even though, you know, we're a rare people. And I think that's why myself and so many others love this series, because it's not trying to act like it doesn't exist within this batshit crazy universe. Again, no pun intended. They are there, they do exist, you might just bump into them, and it is a massive hurdle to overcome in this job. We as an audience may love these supervillains, but for your average detective, they are shit out of luck if they come up against a freeze ray. And the best part is that Gotham Central kept that at the forefront, and it allowed me to get comfortable with the idea of enjoying this as a police procedural book. And it does an excellent job of making every element of the job feel real, despite it being set against the backdrop of the Bat family. The interviews were tense and had me analysing the dialogue for clues and slip-ups. Being on the crime scenes felt overwhelming, especially when there was a news crew nearby, and I loved that it captured that noise and how hectic the job was. Every time a character walked into that office, you just got that feeling that they were already behind on work, and I think a large part of why that works is because it had storylines that revolved both around the night shift and the day, which was a great choice that really paid off because it gave you that sense that it just never ends. The only reason that I think that works is because there's a handful of characters that are just really easy to get behind. Of course, Alan and Montoya were the two standouts, and I feel like the series wasn't as good if they weren't the focus, because the Gotham Central series as a whole doesn't have an overarching plot or some kind of objective that the department really wants to achieve by the end, so having a few key characters that were easy to get behind was essential for this. And I loved how Crispus and Renee weren't perfect cops, but they were always trying the best, and they at least had the right moral compass in this city where they don't know if the person sitting next to them might be corrupt, and the bureaucracy of it all kept stopping them from doing the right thing. Renee in particular had the most interesting journey, to the point where I feel like I might have to elaborate on it a bit during the spoiler section, but her character also made the series feel a bit dated to me, and it's good in a way, and it does show that hopefully times are changing. And again, I'm not trying to downplay anything or be woke or be asleep or whatever the buzzword is that people use at the minute, but I'd like to think that if Gotham Central was written today, it would feel quite forced if they had this lesbian character be such a controversial plot point and have all of the surrounding characters acting in the way that they did. I'd hope they wouldn't be a big deal, they would just be something that they could mention and then just move on with it. And the fact that Brooklyn Nine-Nine pretty much stole this entire character arc kind of proves that. Additionally, how did this book get me as invested in her relationship with her parents as it did with some of the cases that were going on? I didn't think that was going to happen, yet here I am, and her parents would get dragged into one of the storylines, and I would for some reason be on the edge of my seat, wondering how it will affect the connection or if it will cause Renee to spiral. To have that in this book again just speaks to the strength of the writing. And as well, some of my favourite scenes were the handful of moments where we'd see characters sit down for dinner together, and I loved how it humanised the squad so that they weren't just detectives that were working in Batman City, but they felt like real people. And especially towards the end, it gave some actions major weight because I cared about them so much. And there were way more characters that I liked beyond just them two. Rami was a character that I became more and more interested in, especially when Batman would crop up into the conversation. Having a character that just really doesn't like him I find to be so ironic, especially considering that I am a fan of The Dark Knight, and it does just help you to fit into the shoes of somebody that would be living in Gotham City. And the revolving door of captains and lieutenants was a detail of this that I really enjoyed seeing play out, and that was something that I found quite funny, to put it bluntly. When a character would die or they'd be forced out of the story, Which, yeah, I know, sounds hilarious. It's mostly permanent, but it's never really that big of a deal. Sure, characters react to it and you feel the loss of their presence, especially when you're in the office, but especially during the Joker storyline, I loved how normal death was for this department. And especially in the comics medium as a whole, death is kind of a joke that doesn't really have any lasting ramifications, but it is always played up for a lot of attention. It would be put on the front cover, you'd be forced to know it's going to happen before you've even bought the issue. Yet it's the exact opposite in Gotham Central, because death does have meaning and it does have implications, but it doesn't steal all the attention away from the storyline because it's just another part of the job. And that's crazy because we get to see so many of the relationships that go on within this department. And I just love how Rucka and Brubaker are able to remember where everyone's at. This is one of those books where every character feels like they're the protagonist in their own story. It's not just about Renee, Crispus, Marcus, or any of them, but at the same time they're dealing with their own shit, they may work with people that they like or dislike, and all of that, all of those little details and nuances and subtleties just added to the realism of this book. And seeing all of that play out was one of the most fascinating parts of Gotham Central. And I think that's why it's a bit unfair that this gets remembered as a book that shouldn't be as good as it is. I'm gonna go on a tangent here that'll hopefully make sense, but when I reviewed The Immortal Hulk, the hype level for that was so high that I was pretty much promised it was going to be the greatest comic series of all time, that it was going to completely change the way that I even looked at the character, that I even looked at the medium, and it was going to get my parents to say that they loved me again. And unfortunately, there was just no way that any book would be able to live up to that hype. And it's almost like Gotham Central's in the exact opposite situation. I'm guilty of it myself, but labeling it as a book that is way better than it has any right to be is kind of doing it a disservice. It almost feels like the bar's being lowered a bit for it, and if it's just alright, then we'll label it as great. But the book that we've got here is so much more than its concept. It's not just great because it sounds like something that we shouldn't enjoy, but because of the work that Rucka and Brubaker did. I don't know if that makes any sense, but what I'm saying is that there's a difference between winning a race and breaking a world record. And I've babbled on now for God knows how long about the great character work, so if you're watching to this point, thank you. But the storylines are also great in Gotham Central. It's one of those modern books that really lends itself well to the issue by issue structure, but it is still great to read in one complete collection, because this is effectively a collection of cases that are dealt with by the GCPD. That overarching plot that I talked about, it is a little bit more subtle, it's not really going to hit you in the face from issue 1. Sure, some of the story arcs are better than the others, but there's not one that I can point to that really felt like a drag. Even the storyline about high schoolers, and they had that cold case that they were reopening and it connected to the Mad Hatter, even that was a joy to read when they were using more minor Batman characters. And I think that's another thing that I have to give it respect for, because it didn't just use all of the big hitters from the Batman universe, and it really knew how to balance it out. The Dark Knight's weight and presence is always there, and there was a conversation that I really liked early on where they were debating whether or not they should turn on the signal, and what kind of message that gives out to the city. And I love that perspective, because when you're reading a Batman book, it's great to see it because you know you're going to get some action, but for the GCPD, it's them admitting that they need a vigilante's help. Another thing that this really opened my eyes to was just how violent and intimidating Batman can be. Because it's kind of like with horror movies, that the more that you see of the monster, the less scary they are. But because we're not following Batman, there would be a moment where you'd just appear and you'd feel that shock, you'd understand the surprise of the characters, or you'd see officers interviewing somebody that Batman had beat up and you'd be like, yeah, okay, Bruce went a little bit far this time. But unfortunately it can't all be glowing unanimous praise, and there were a handful of occasions where it did seem to cash in on the Bat family, but there could be a big cliffhanger to an issue where you'd see the shadow or the silhouette of somebody that you recognise and you'd be excited to read the next part of the story, and they'd just appear for like the first page and then disappear. And the story would just seem to continue on as if nothing had happened, and you'd wonder what was the point of that in the first place. I'm looking at you, Huntress, and not in the way that I used to when I was a lonely teenager. And it was the moments like that that would throw me out of the story a bit, and it's disappointing because it built so much goodwill up before by avoiding all of these gimmicks. And it is a very fine line between throwing icons in for the sake of it and to maybe boost your sales up a bit and pretending that they don't exist. And I'd say about 90% of the time, Gotham Central does get it right, that it doesn't really feel too forced, but there were definitely some storylines that felt like they had an idea and they just borrowed what they needed, and then there were others that felt like they centered around a moment just for the sake of the front cover. And worse so is when the wider DC universe had to be thrown into it. Yeah, I'll be the first to admit that it was just for a single issue, but it was also the worst issue in this entire book. Yes, I am talking about the weird Infinite Crisis crossover. As an event apologist, I love Infinite Crisis, but by God, it it did not feel welcome here. It almost felt like a parody of everything that Gotham Central was trying to not be from the beginning. And don't get me wrong, it could have been cool, especially because we don't often get an on-the-ground look when these world-ending events are happening, but this genuinely felt like Rucka and Brubaker were told that they had to write this an hour before the deadline was due. It didn't advance anything, and it came so late on in the story that it felt like it was wasting time, and worse so, the story itself was forgettable. Actually, there was another issue that was only slightly better, and that was Stacy's story, which is a little bit difficult to say when you've got a lisp. I get the feeling I'm going to be in the minority with this one, and again, it's another one of those concepts that sounds like it would be interesting, you know, following the temp that's tasked with turning on the bat symbol because of the bureaucracy that surrounds it, and it might make me bad at this job, but I can't put my finger on why I didn't enjoy this. It might have had something to do with the change in art, or the fact that it came after the Two-Face storyline, but just before the Joker one, but whatever it was, this felt like way longer than a single issue, and I found myself caring less and less the longer that it went on. Although before I was praising the case-by-case storyline, so inevitably there's got to be some kind of downside to that, and if it means that 2 issues out of the 40 aren't to my liking, then okay, I'll take that. And again, it might speak to the strength of the series that I have to nitpick 2 single issues just to have some kind of negative in this. And I've touched on it a little bit, but the arcs within this, like the Dead Robins, the Joker storyline, Half a Life, and even the Warzone crossover, all brought something new and exciting to the table. This really is one of those books where no 2 arcs feel the same, or that there's ever a point where it's just treading water. It's kind of making this review a bit difficult because I want to leave some surprises in case there are people that haven't read this. So I just wanted to highlight some of the things that it does really well throughout, rather than spoiling some of the finer details. And something else that was consistent regardless of the story that it was telling was the level of tension. Renee being kidnapped felt as tense as the Joker's bomb threat, which was as intense as a crime that involved robbing. And part of the fun of this series was not knowing what was going to happen next or what was waiting for me in the next story arc. So maybe if I ever do a podcast, I'll do a full episode dedicated to Gotham Central, but on the slim chance that there's somebody watching this that hasn't read this book before, I don't want to spoil some of those subtle moments that I really enjoyed in this series, and I just recommend picking this up. And despite that and some of the things that I've said earlier, this ends in a way that feels complete but also natural. It shouldn't be a spoiler to say that the GCPD isn't going to shut down or that everybody's just going to quit at the same time, but for a series that often felt like it wasn't working towards something bigger, I was pleasantly surprised with how they closed this. Then again, I can't really talk much more about the ending without jumping into spoilers. This is your final spoiler warning, so if you don't want anything ruined, skip to the final verdict, but I have to talk about Alan's death. It's weird because earlier I said that this series didn't feel like it had this grand overarching plot, but his death had that climactic 3rd act feel to it. The best part about this is that it didn't feel dragged out, but at the same time everything had enough time so that it could marinate and really reach its full potential. And because it was given that time, we got to see Corrigan slowly start to become a bit paranoid about the whole thing. And I love that we got to see him trying to cover his tracks, the discussions that he had with his partner. It felt like those would be the things that they would admit, but I'm glad that they were there. And as much as I didn't want Alan to die, I feel like it was a necessary evil to get this phenomenal final arc. Additionally, it was just great that the whole Corrigan storyline built up to be something. I thought he was just going to be that corrupt cop that's always doing dodgy things on the side but never really gets caught, and he never does anything too bad. But everything that was being built up throughout the rest of the series really came to a head in that final arc, and it was so quick it kind of gave me whiplash, but in the best way possible because it was done so in a way that I just didn't expect. Also, just knowing where Montoya's story goes after this in 52 made me quite happy with the fact that she decided to leave the GCPD, because I knew that everything was going to be alright for it, and I liked that it felt like she made this decision on her own accord, despite the fact that a lot of the plot lines that are going on throughout this just felt like they were trying to push her out of the job. So it was just great seeing that she was making this decision because she wanted to, even if it was, you know, caused by her partner dying. But after all the Two-Face stuff, her being outed, all the Lopari stuff, and the majority of her colleagues not standing by her, it felt like pretty much everything that happened in this book was pushing her to quit, but she eked it out until she knew what she wanted to do. So with me saying that the ending is bittersweet, this is what I mean by it, because in the weirdest way, she kind of got a happy ending. In some regards, like I am in no way saying that Alan dying is any kind of positive for her. And admittedly, you knew it was what she kind of had to do after she just burst into Corrigan's apartment, put the gun into his face, and I really wish that she'd pulled the trigger. And that was just a phenomenal scene, and it solidifies what I was saying earlier, that if it wasn't for these characters, we just would not care about this story as much. Any book can have an intriguing concept, but you have to do something more than that, and her story arc proved it. This is my final verdict, and there's no pseudo-intellectual statement that I want to make to kick this off. I just want to say that Gotham Central is a top-tier comic. On my first reading many years ago, I was just just happy to have a comic that managed to stand on its own 2 feet even when Batman wasn't present. But coming back to it now on this reading, I can confidently say that this would still be a great book regardless of what city it's set in. Sure, I can't deny that having characters like Two-Face and Robin and Joker doesn't help give Gotham Central a unique spin that other crime dramas would only be able to achieve if they were willing to take on a lawsuit, but I also can't sit here and pretend that the only reason why Gotham Central works is because it's set in the DC universe. It's so much more than that, with a great array of characters, interesting political and philosophical angles, and cases that could only be told in this setting while still not forgetting its crime storytelling roots. There's a reason why this series is remembered so fondly and why I wasn't surprised to see it chart so high in the top 100 omnibuses. This book is great regardless of if you've read Batman or crime fiction before, and the few hiccups that there are, such as the inconsistencies in the quality of the art, the plots that don't really land as well as the others, or that single time where the wider DC universe did have a negative impact on the series, can be forgiven because of the overall level of quality that we see throughout. What Gotham Central does best is add to a world that I already love, but gives me a different perspective without tarnishing what I enjoyed already. There's not many other titles like this, so don't be afraid to revisit it if you haven't done so in years, or if you're picking this up for the first time and you're worried it won't live up to the hype, because Rucka and Brubaker have created something timeless here if it wasn't evident from the fact that I've been whittering on for this long and I don't even know if I've made a coherent point. So if I had to sum this up in one sentence, I'd probably say you should put down whatever book you're reading and check out Gotham Central immediately. So that's my review. It's my first one back since I've been ill, so hopefully it's been okay, but until next time, just make sure that you stay safe and stay mad, all you dogs. Woof woof. See you at the next video.